Imagine waking up knowing that today they might come for you, not because you've done anything wrong, not because you've committed any crime, but because someone, somewhere a neighbor with a grudge, a relative who owes you money, a stranger being tortured in a dungeon beneath the town hall, has spoken your name. And in Europe, for 300 years, that was enough. One accusation, and your life as you knew it was over. The year could be 1590, or 1620, or 1680. The place could be a village in Germany, a town in Scotland, a city in France. The details varied, but the pattern was always the same. Someone pointed a finger. Someone whispered the word witch. And then the machinery of persecution ground into motion arrest. Imprisonment, torture, trial, and almost inevitably, death. Welcome to the European witch trials, the longest and deadliest mass persecution in Western history. Between roughly 1450 and 1750. Somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 people were executed for the crime of witchcraft across Europe. Some estimates go higher up to 100,000 when you include those who died in prison, under torture, or by mob violence without trial. The vast majority were women. The vast majority were innocent of anything except being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemies. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. And honestly, surviving the algorithm is almost as hard as surviving an accusation of witchcraft. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. You've just woken up in early modern Europe, and someone has called you a witch. This wasn't the witch trial you might know from Salem. That was a single outbreak. 9 months in 1692, a footnote compared to what happened in Europe. The European witch trials lasted for 3 centuries. They consumed entire regions. They turned neighbors into informants, families into enemies, communities into killing fields. They created a machinery of persecution so efficient that once it started in a region, it was almost impossible to stop. The witch of the European trials wasn't the cackling hag of fairy tales, though that stereotype would emerge from this period. She could be anyone: a healer who used herbs, a midwife whose patient died, a beggar who cursed someone who refused her charity, a wealthy widow whose property someone coveted, a child who told strange stories, a man who was simply unpopular. Anyone could be accused, and once accused, almost no one escaped. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore how this happened. How did medieval Europe, which had largely ignored witchcraft for centuries, suddenly become convinced that Satan's servants were everywhere? How did ordinary people come to denounce their neighbors, their friends, their own family members? How did the torture chambers fill and the fires burn, year after year, decade after decade? This is the brutal reality of the European witch trials. Get comfortable. The inquisitors are waiting. To understand the witch trials, you first need to understand what came before them. A world where magic was normal, practitioners were tolerated, and the church had bigger concerns than village healers. In medieval Europe, magic was simply part of life. People believed in a world filled with invisible forces, spirits, and powers that could be manipulated by those who knew how. This wasn't considered evil or demonic. It was just how the universe worked. If you wanted to cure a sick cow, you might call on the local cunning woman who knew which herbs to use and which words to say. If you wanted to find lost property, the cunning man might use divination. If you wanted protection for your home, there were charms and rituals for that. These practitioners went by many names. Cunning folk in England, Devons and Devinairesses in France, Hexen in German-speaking lands. They were part of village life, consulted for everything from illness to love problems to identifying thieves. Some were respected members of the community. Some were feared, but they were accepted, a normal feature of the social landscape. The medieval church's position on magic was complicated, but generally tolerant. Yes, the church taught that magic that invoked demons was sinful, but most folk magic didn't claim any demonic connection. It worked through herbs, through words, through sympathetic principles that seemed natural rather than supernatural. The church focused its attention on heresy-wrong beliefs about God and doctrine, not on village healers mixing potions. When the church did address magic, it often expressed skepticism. The Canon Episcopi, a 10th century church document, declared that beliefs about flying through the night to attend gatherings of witches were delusions and dreams, not reality. Women who claimed such experiences were to be pitied for their foolishness, not burned for their crimes. The devil could create illusions, the church taught, but he couldn't actually give humans magical powers. For centuries, this remained the dominant view. Local priests might lecture against superstition. Bishops might occasionally investigate a case of alleged sorcery. But there was no systematic persecution, no hunting of witches, no mass executions. The witch, as the trials would later define her, simply didn't exist yet. Something changed in the 15th century. The tolerant medieval world began to give way to something darker, more paranoid, more deadly. The witch was about to be invented. The witch of the European. Trials didn't evolve naturally from medieval beliefs about magic. She was deliberately created, constructed by theologians and inquisitors, who combined old folk beliefs with new theological ideas to produce something unprecedented. The concept of a vast satanic conspiracy threatening all of Christendom. The key innovation was the idea of the demonic pact. Medieval magic users hadn't necessarily been seen as servants of the devil. But starting in the 14th and 15th centuries, theologians began arguing that any magic that worked must have demonic assistance. If you healed someone with herbs and charms, that healing came from Satan, whether you knew it or not. If you cursed someone and they fell ill, the devil had granted you that power in exchange for your soul. This transformed magic from a sin or a delusion into a conspiracy. The witch wasn't just someone who did bad things. She was an agent of Satan, part of an organized army working to destroy Christianity. She had formally renounced God, signed a pact with the devil, sometimes literally, in blood, and pledged herself to evil. She attended secret meetings called sabbats, where witches gathered to worship Satan, engage in orgies, kill and eat children, and planned their attacks on Christian society. None of this had any basis in what actual accused witches believed or did. It was an intellectual construction, created by educated men, imposed on the accused through leading questions and torture. But it transformed the stakes entirely. A village healer was a minor problem. A member of Satan's army was an existential threat. The new concept crystallized in 1486 with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, written by the German Dominican friar Heinrich Krummer. This book became the handbook for witch hunters across Europe for the next 2 centuries. It explained what witches were, how to identify them, how to try them, and why they must be destroyed. The Malleus was particularly vicious toward women. Kramer argued that women were inherently weaker, more susceptible to demonic temptation, more lustful and vengeful than men. They made natural witches. The book's misogyny helped shape the gender disparity of the trials. Approximately 80% of those executed were female. The printing press, invented just decades earlier, spread the Malleus across Europe. It went through numerous editions, becoming one of the best-selling books of its era. With it spread the new idea of the witch, not a healer or a fortune teller, but a servant of Satan, a member of a secret cult, an enemy of humanity. If you're enjoying this journey into European darkness, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the conditions for mass persecution are about to get even worse. The witch trials didn't happen because of the Malleus Maleficarum alone. They happened because Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was experiencing a perfect storm of crises that made people desperate for explanations and scapegoats. The Reformation shattered religious unity. Starting in 1517, Protestant reformers challenged Catholic authority, splitting Europe into hostile camps. Wars of religion devastated entire regions. Families were divided, communities torn apart. Both Catholics and Protestants became hypervigilant about threats to the faith, and both sides found witches. Indeed, the witch trials peaked in the borderlands where Catholic and Protestant territories met, where religious anxiety was highest. The Little Ice Age brought climate chaos. Starting in the mid-16th century, temperatures dropped significantly. Harvests failed. Famine spread. Alpine glaciers advanced, destroying villages. People who had experienced relatively stable weather for generations suddenly faced crop failures, livestock deaths, and starvation. Someone must be causing this. Someone must be using maleficium harmful magic to destroy the harvests. Disease swept through populations. Plague returned repeatedly. Other epidemics followed. Infant mortality was horrific, even in good times. In bad times, watching your children die became almost normal. But people needed someone to blame. The witch who had cursed you, who had sent disease to your family, provided an explanation and a target. Political instability created fear and opportunity. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting. Local lords competed for power. In many German territories, witch trials became a tool of political consolidation, a way for rulers to demonstrate their godly commitment to fighting evil, to seize property from the accused, to remove troublesome elements from their domains. Economic pressures intensified social tensions. Population growth strained resources. Inequality widened. The poor became poorer. The marginal became more marginal. Beggars multiplied, and refusing charity to a beggar who then cursed you became a classic origin story for witch accusations. The beggar woman you turned away, what if she really had cursed you? What if that's why your cow died? All of these factors combined to create an atmosphere of pervasive fear and suspicion. People were scared, traumatized, looking for explanations. The concept of the witch, the secret enemy within the community, the servant of Satan causing all this suffering, provided exactly what they needed. And once the accusations started, they proved very, very hard to stop. The Malleus Maleficarum deserves its own examination, because no other book contributed more to the deaths of accused witches. It was a manual for murder, dressed up as theology, and it shaped witch hunting for 200 years. Heinrich Kramer wrote the Malleus after being thrown out of Innsbruck for his overzealous witch hunting. The local bishop had criticized his methods and his obsession with the sexual behavior of accused women. Humiliated but undeterred, Kramer poured his beliefs into a comprehensive treatise that would outlast his critics. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first argues that witchcraft is real, that doubting its existence is heresy, and that witches genuinely have the power to cause harm through their pact with Satan. It demolished the older church position that witchcraft was delusion. Anyone who denied the reality of witches was themselves suspect. The second part describes what witches do, how they fly to sabbats, how they have sex with demons, how they cause impotence in men, how they kill infants, how they raise storms and destroy crops. These descriptions came not from any actual evidence, but from confessions extracted under torture. Confessions shaped by leading questions based on the very beliefs the Malleus was promoting. It was a circular system. The book said witches did these things. So inquisitors asked about these things. So accused witches confessed to these things, which proved the book was right. The third part provided practical guidance for identifying, arresting, trying, and executing witches. It explained which legal procedures to follow, how to overcome defenses, when to use torture, how to extract confessions. It was a how-to guide for prosecution, and it tilted every procedural advantage toward conviction. The Malleus's influence spread through the new technology of printing. Between 1486 and 1520, it went through 14 editions. By 1669, there had been at least 30 editions in multiple languages. Judges, magistrates, and clergy across Europe consulted it as an authoritative reference. Its procedures became standard practice in witch trials from Germany to Scotland to France. Not everyone accepted the Malleus. Some theologians criticized it. Some jurisdictions rejected its more extreme recommendations. But its core ideas that witches were real, that they served Satan, that they must be destroyed, became the foundation of the witch-hunting enterprise. Heinrich Kramer died in obscurity, but his book killed tens of thousands. The stereotype of the accused witch is an old woman poor, ugly, isolated, perhaps muttering to herself, living on the margins of the village. There's some truth to this image, but it's incomplete. The witch trials consumed people of every description. Women made up approximately 80% of the accused and executed. The reasons were multiple. The Malleus Maleficarum's explicit misogyny, beliefs about women's greater susceptibility to temptation, women's concentration in roles, healing, midwifery that could be reinterpreted as witchcraft, and simple vulnerability. Women without male protectors, widows, spinsters, those abandoned by husbands were particularly at risk. Age mattered, but not always in the expected direction. Many accused were older women, yes, women past childbearing, women who had outlived their economic usefulness in a patriarchal society. But young women were also accused, sometimes in large numbers. In some outbreaks, children were primary targets. Poverty was common among the accused, but not universal. In some trials, the wealthy and respectable were specifically targeted. Property confiscation was a significant motive in witch trials. The assets of convicted witches typically went to the state, the church, or the accusers. In the Bamberg trials, the prince-bishop systematically accused wealthy citizens and seized their estates. Men were about 20% of the accused, and in some regions, Iceland, Estonia, Finland, they were actually the majority. Male witches were often associated with specific roles: shepherds whose flocks prospered suspiciously, smiths who worked with fire and transformation, cunning men whose healing practices could be reinterpreted as dark magic. Children appeared on both sides of the accusations. Child accusers, like the girls of Salem, provided devastating testimony because they were assumed to be too innocent to lie. Child accused were tortured and executed alongside adults in Wurzburg. Children as young as 7 were burned. Social position provided no protection. Priests were accused. Mayors were accused. In Bamberg, the vice-chancellor of the prince-bishop was accused, tortured, and executed. Once the machinery of persecution started, it could consume anyone, regardless of status, wealth, or respectability. The only consistent pattern was vulnerability. People who had made enemies, who were socially marginal, who had suffered some misfortune that could be blamed on others, who were simply in the wrong place when the accusations started flying. The accusation rarely came out of nowhere. Usually, there was a history, a chain of events that led a community or an individual to identify someone as a witch. Asterisk, the most common trigger was misfortune. A cow died unexpectedly. A child fell ill. A storm destroyed the harvest. A man became impotent. In a world without germ theory or scientific meteorology, these events demanded explanation. If the misfortune followed a quarrel, a refused request, an exchange of angry words, the explanation seemed obvious. The other person had cursed you. Consider a typical pattern. A poor woman comes to your door asking for food or charity. You refuse. Times are hard. You have your own family to feed. She mutters something as she leaves. Maybe she curses you. Maybe she just complains. Maybe she says nothing intelligible at all. A week later, your cow dies. You remember the beggar woman. You remember the muttering. Suddenly, the connection seems clear. She cursed you. She's a witch. This pattern refused charity, followed by misfortune appears again and again in trial records. It reflects the tensions of communities where resources were scarce, where the traditional obligation to help the poor conflicted with the practical inability to do so. The witch accusation resolved the guilt of refusing charity by transforming the refused beggar into an aggressor, reputation built over time. Once someone was known as a suspected witch, every subsequent misfortune in the community might be attributed to her. The reputation could simmer for years, even decades, before resulting in formal accusation. Some accused witches had been suspected for 20 or 30 years before anyone took legal action. A formal accusation often came at a moment of crisis. A particularly severe run of bad luck, a community-wide disaster, pressure from authorities to identify witches. Any of these could transform long-standing suspicion into legal action. The accused might not even know she was suspected until the moment of her arrest. Sometimes, the accusation came from torture chambers rather than the community. An accused witch, under unbearable pain, was asked who else she had seen at the Sabbath. She named names: anyone whose face came to mind, anyone she had quarreled with, anyone she thought her torturers wanted to hear. These named individuals were then arrested, tortured, and forced to name others. The chain reaction could consume an entire town. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. Because we're about to explore how ordinary people became instruments of persecution. The witch trials required denunciations. Someone had to make the initial accusation, had to testify about maleficium, had to identify the witch. These accusers were usually not strangers, but neighbors, people who had lived alongside the accused for years, sometimes for their entire lives. What made someone denounce a neighbor? Often, it was the accumulation of grievances. The accused had slighted them, had argued over property boundaries, had let their animals stray into the neighbor's field, had spoken sharply at some community gathering. These petty conflicts, common in any village, became deadly when the framework of witchcraft provided a way to act on them. Debt was a frequent motive. In small communities, informal credit was common lending tools, helping with harvest, providing food in hard times with the expectation of future repayment. When these debts remained unpaid, resentment built. Accusing your creditor of witchcraft was a way to cancel the debt permanently and strike back at someone you felt had wronged you. Family disputes fed the trials. Inheritance conflicts, in-law tensions, long-running feuds between branches of families, all could erupt into witchcraft accusations. In some cases, family members denounced each other. Children testified against parents. Husbands betrayed wives. The trials shattered families as thoroughly as they shattered communities. Economic competition played a role. If your neighbor's business was thriving while yours struggled, witchcraft provided an explanation. If a rival was succeeding where you failed, perhaps she had supernatural help. The accused were sometimes the more prosperous, brought down by the envy of the less successful. Some accusers genuinely believed in the witchcraft they reported. They were convinced that the accused had harmed them through magic, that the misfortunes they suffered had supernatural causes. Their accusations were sincere, even if completely wrong. Others knew or suspected that their accusations were false, but made them anyway, using the witch trial system as a weapon. The community pressure to conform could be intense. Once a witch hunt began, failure to support it might attract suspicion. If you defended the accused, perhaps you were in league with her. If you expressed doubt, perhaps you were protecting fellow witches. Staying silent or joining the accusers was often the only safe choice. The knock came usually at night. Armed men, perhaps the town watch, perhaps officials of the court, appeared at your door with a warrant for your arrest. You were accused of witchcraft, and you were coming with them. The arrest itself was often violent and degrading. You might be dragged from your bed, given no time to dress properly, bound immediately to prevent you from using your supposed powers. The arresting officers might have been instructed not to let you touch the ground witches were believed, to draw power from the earth, so you would be carried, or placed on a cart. Your house would be searched for evidence. Any herbs, any unusual objects, any written materials could be seized as proof of witchcraft. Items that were perfectly normal, the herbs every household kept for cooking and medicine, the charms against ill fortune that everyone used, became evidence of demonic practice when, found in a suspected witch's home, the prison awaited. In most jurisdictions, this meant a cell in the local jail, or in dungeons beneath a town hall or castle. Conditions were deliberately harsh. The cells were often underground, dark, damp, crawling with vermin. You might be chained to the wall or floor, unable to move freely, unable to tend to your most basic needs. The theory behind harsh imprisonment was theological. Witches drew power from Satan, and that connection had to be broken. Keeping you in darkness, in filth, in isolation, weakened your demonic powers and made you more likely to confess. The suffering was considered part of the process. You would be stripped and your body searched. Every inch of your skin would be examined for the witch's mark, any blemish, mole, scar, or unusual feature that might be the spot where your familiar, a demonic spirit in animal form, suckled your blood. If no obvious mark was found, they would shave your entire body, head to toe, to ensure nothing was hidden beneath the hair. The searching was often conducted by men, regardless of the prisoner's gender. It was deliberately humiliating, a violation that began the process of breaking down your resistance. You were no longer a person with dignity and rights. You were a suspected servant of Satan, and you would be treated accordingly. The devil's mark was considered definitive proof of the demonic pact. When a witch pledged herself to Satan, the devil supposedly marked her body, just as a farmer might brand cattle. Finding this mark was therefore crucial to the prosecution. The mark could take any form: a mole, a birthmark, a scar, a patch of discolored skin, a wart. Any irregularity whatsoever could be interpreted as the devil's mark. Since virtually everyone has some skin blemishes, finding potential marks was easy. The challenge was proving that a particular mark was actually diabolic. The test was simple and cruel. The devil's mark was believed to be insensitive to pain. A needle or pin would be driven into the suspected mark. If the accused didn't react to the pain, or if the wound didn't bleed, the mark was confirmed as the devil's. If she screamed and bled, the searchers would move on to the next blemish and try again. Professional witch prickers emerged, particularly in Scotland and England. These were men, occasionally women, who made their living traveling from town to town, searching accused witches for the devil's mark. They charged fees for their services and had obvious financial incentives to find marks and confirm accusations. Some prickers used tricks. Retractable needles, like stage props, would appear to penetrate the flesh while actually retracting into the handle, producing no pain or blood. The pricker could thus confirm the devil's mark on anyone, ensuring continued employment and convictions. The entire procedure was designed to produce evidence. Keep pricking someone long enough, and you'll eventually find a spot where the pain is less acute or the bleeding is minimal. Nerve dead zones exist on everyone's body. The search wasn't investigation. It was confirmation of a predetermined conclusion. The psychological impact was as important as the physical. Being stripped, shaved, and pricked repeatedly, with every blemish on your body discussed and examined by hostile strangers, broke down resistance. By the time the actual interrogation began, many accused were already desperate, willing to say anything to make the humiliation stop. Of all the tests used to identify witches, the swimming test was perhaps the most grimly absurd. It offered only two outcomes: death by drowning or conviction as a witch. The logic was theological. Water was wholly used in baptism, blessed by the church. Witches, having renounced their baptism and allied with Satan, would be rejected by water. They would float, unable to sink into the element that refused to receive them. Innocent people, still embraced by God, would sink. The procedure was public spectacle. The accused would be bound typically with her right thumb tied to her left toe and vice versa to prevent swimming motions. She would be attached to a rope so she could be retrieved. Then she would be thrown into a river, lake, or specially dug pond while the community watched Dot. If she floated, she was guilty. The water had rejected her, proving her diabolic nature. She would be pulled out, imprisoned, and face further trial, torture, and execution. If she sank, she was innocent, but innocent was often synonymous with dead. Drowned before the handlers could pull her back up. The swimming test was popular in England and Scotland, where judicial torture was restricted and other means of producing confessions were needed. It provided evidence that didn't require the elaborate torture apparatus of continental Europe. It also provided entertainment for the crowd that gathered to watch. Some jurisdictions banned the swimming test as unreliable or barbaric. Many continental European courts, ironically, considered it too irregular and unscientific compared to their own methods of judicial torture. But in regions where it was practiced, it condemned countless innocent people. The survivors were not necessarily better off. Having floated, having been proven guilty by the water test, they faced conviction and execution. The test didn't determine guilt or innocence. It determined whether you died immediately by drowning or later by fire or rope. If you're still with me on this dark journey, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives for your bedtime listening. And speaking of things that will keep you up at night, let's enter the torture chamber. In continental Europe, judicial torture was legal and standard practice in witch trials. The theory was simple. Witches served Satan, who gave them the strength to resist ordinary questioning. Only through torture could that diabolic resistance be broken and the truth extracted. The torture chamber was usually located in the basement of the town hall, castle, or prison. It was a room of stone, equipped with instruments designed to produce pain without immediately killing. The torturer, sometimes called the executioner, since he often served both functions, was a professional, trained in the techniques of inflicting suffering. The strappado was common. Your hands would be tied behind your back, and you would be hoisted by a rope attached to your wrists. Your shoulders would bear your entire weight in an unnatural position, dislocating them. You might be raised and dropped repeatedly. The jerking stops intensifying the agony. Weights might be attached to your feet, increasing the stress on your joints. The rack stretched your body, pulling your arms and legs in opposite directions until joints separated and tendons tore. The wheel could break bones systematically, limb by limb. Thumb screws crushed fingers. Leg screws crushed shins. Boots metallivises around the lower legs were tightened until bones fractured. Sleep deprivation was considered mild torture, used before or between sessions with physical instruments. You would be kept awake for days, walked constantly by guards, denied any rest until your mind began to fragment. Many confessed just to be allowed to sleep. The torturer was instructed to proceed gradually, beginning with lighter methods and escalating only if necessary. But since the goal was confession, and innocent people had nothing true to confess, escalation was almost inevitable. The torture continued until you confessed or died. Everyone confessed. Given enough pain, every accused witch eventually said what her torturers wanted to hear. The question was never whether you would confess, only how long you could hold out. The confessions followed patterns because the interrogators asked leading questions based on their expectations. Have you made a pact with the devil? Describe the Sabbath. What form did the devil take when he came to you? How did you fly to the meeting? What did you do there? Who else was present? At first, the accused would deny everything. The torture would begin. The denial would become harder to maintain. At some point after hours, after days, after multiple sessions, the accused would begin to agree with what she was being asked. Yes, the devil came to me. Yes, I made a pact. Yes, I attended the SABBAT. Once the confession began, the interrogators would draw out details. They wanted specifics that matched their theological expectations. The devil appeared as a black man, or a goat, or a dog. He was cold to the touch when you kissed him, the osculum in fame, the infamous kiss. You flew to the Sabbat on a broomstick, or on a demon, or on an animal. At the Sabbat, you danced backwards. You renounced Christ. You committed sexual acts. You ate the flesh of unbaptized children. These details came not from the accused's actual beliefs or experiences, but from the questions themselves and from folklore shared between interrogators across Europe. The remarkable consistency of confessions, German witches and Scottish witches, describing similar Sabbats, was cited as proof that the confessions were true. In fact, it proved only that interrogators were asking similar questions. Some accused came to believe their own confessions. After days of torture and sleep deprivation, the human mind can become convinced of anything. Others knew their confessions were false, but saw no alternative. The torture would continue until you confessed, and once you confessed, it would stop at least temporarily. The confession was often written out by a court clerk and read back to the accused for confirmation. This was supposed to happen freely, without torture, to make the confession legally valid. In practice, the accused knew that denial meant return to the torture chamber. They confirmed that the most devastating question came after the confession. Who else have you seen at the Sabbat? This was the moment when individual persecution became mass persecution. Every name you spoke under torture became a new arrest, a new trial, a new round of torture producing more names. A single accusation could generate dozens, even hundreds, of subsequent cases. The accused had no good options. Refusing to name names meant continued torture. Naming names meant condemning others to the same fate you were suffering. Some tried to name people who were already dead, beyond the reach of persecution. The interrogators weren't fooled. They wanted living names, people who could be arrested and questioned. Some named their enemies, using the opportunity to strike back at those who had wronged them. Some named randomly, throwing out any names that came to mind in their desperation. Some named the people they were closest to, family members, friends, because those were the faces that surfaced in their tormented minds. Under extreme stress, the brain doesn't make careful calculations. The named individuals were arrested and tortured in turn. Most of them confessed and named still more names. The trials expanded in chains, each confession spawning new accusations. In severe outbreaks, these chains could sweep through entire communities, with hundreds of accusations flowing from a single starting point. The dynamic was self-reinforcing. The more people were accused, the more plausible it seemed that a vast conspiracy existed. If so many people were confessing to attending Sabbats, the Sabbats must be real. The very success of the persecution was cited as evidence that persecution was necessary. Attempting to stop the chain was dangerous. If you protested that the accusations had gone too far, that innocent people were being named, you risked suspicion yourself. Perhaps you were trying to protect fellow witches. Perhaps you attended the Sabbath too. Silence and complicity were the only safe responses. In the worst outbreaks, witch trials became self-sustaining persecutions that consumed communities from within. The chain reactions in German territories during the peak years of 1580 to 1630 show how devastating this dynamic could become. Consider Trier. In the Rhineland, during the 1580s and 1590s, the trials began with a few accusations, expanded through torture-produced confessions, and eventually consumed hundreds of victims. Entire villages lost most of their adult female population. 2 villages were left with only 1 woman each. The accused included not just the marginal and vulnerable, but also people of high-status officials, priests, even the rector of the university. Or consider Ellwangen, a small territory in southern Germany. In 1611 to 1612, over 400 people were executed for witchcraft. This in a region with a total population of perhaps 12,000. 1 in 30 people were killed. The trials only stopped when there was almost no one left to accuse. The pattern was consistent. Initial accusations led to confessions under torture. Confessions produced new names. New arrests produced new confessions and more names. The numbers escalated exponentially until some external force intervention by a higher authority, exhaustion of the population, economic collapse finally stopped them. The economic impact was devastating. Witch trials were expensive. Courts charged fees. Torturers had to be paid. Prisoners had to be fed. The accused often had to pay for their own imprisonment. Executioners charged by the service. These costs were supposed to be covered by the property of the convicted, but when hundreds of people were convicted, the costs exceeded the assets. Communities went bankrupt prosecuting witches. Meanwhile, normal life collapsed. Fields went untended because the farmers were dead or in prison. Businesses closed. Children were orphaned. The social fabric of entire regions was shredded. The witch trials didn't just kill individuals. They killed communities. The trial itself was often a formality. By the time an accused witch faced the court, she had usually already confessed under torture. The trial was simply the official confirmation of what the torture chamber had established. Continental European trials followed the inquisitorial model. There was no jury. The judges, usually local magistrates or officials of the territorial lord, controlled the proceedings. They questioned the accused, evaluated the evidence, and rendered the verdict. Defense attorneys, where they were permitted at all, could do little against a confession. The evidence consisted primarily of the confession itself. Having admitted to the demonic pact, to attending Sabbaths, to causing harm through magic, what defense could be offered? Recanting the confession was possible, but dangerous. It suggested that the devil was giving you strength to resist, that more torture was needed. Most did not attempt it. Other evidence might include testimony from accusers about the maleficium you had allegedly caused, the death of their cattle, the illness of their children, the failure of their crops. Physical evidence might include the devil's mark found on your body, suspicious items found in your home, anything that could be interpreted as tools of witchcraft. The verdict was almost always guilty. Acquittals did happen, particularly in jurisdictions with stricter evidentiary standards, but they were rare. The system was designed to convict. If you had reached the point of trial, you had already been identified as a witch, tortured into confession, and declared guilty in everything but name. The sentence for witchcraft was death. The method varied by jurisdiction and by the specifics of the case. Burning was common, especially in German-speaking territories, because fire was believed to purify and prevent the witch's spirit from returning. Hanging was more common in England and Scotland. Sometimes a mercy was granted strangulation before burning, so the condemned died more quickly. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment. Because we're now at the end that awaited almost every accused witch. Public execution. The execution was a spectacle. A public event designed to demonstrate the power of justice and the fate of those who allied with Satan. Crowds gathered to watch. Authorities used the occasion to reinforce moral and social order. The condemned was displayed as an example of what happened to those who strayed. Before the execution, the condemned might be given the opportunity to confess publicly, to warn others against following her path, to express repentance for her crimes. Some did so, either sincerely or because they hoped for a less painful death. Public confession and repentance might earn strangulation before burning rather than burning alive. The condemned was typically transported to the execution site in a cart, often with the executioner accompanying her. She might wear a sign describing her crimes. She might have her head shaved, her clothes removed, or reduced to a simple shift. Every element was designed to humiliate, to strip away identity and dignity. Burning was the standard execution for severe cases. The condemned was tied to a stake set in a pile of wood and kindling. The fire was lit, and the crowd watched as the flames consumed her. Death came from smoke inhalation, heat shock, or the flames themselves, a process that could take anywhere from minutes to hours, depending on how the fire burned. Strangulation before burning was considered merciful. The executioner would strangle the condemned with a rope before lighting the fire, ensuring she was dead before the flames touched her. This mercy was sometimes granted to those who confessed freely, cooperated with authorities, or showed proper repentance. Hanging was more common in England and its American colonies, where burning was reserved for certain crimes like treason. The condemned was placed on a ladder or cart, a rope around her neck, and then dropped or the support removed. If done properly, the neck broke and death was quick. If not, the condemned strangled slowly. The bodies of executed witches are often left on display as warnings or buried in unconsecrated ground, denied the normal Christian funeral rites. Even in death, they remained outside the community they had supposedly threatened. Germany, or more precisely, the patchwork of territories that made up the Holy Roman Empire, was the heartland of the European witch trials. More than half of all executions occurred in German-speaking lands. The reasons were structural. The empire was fragmented into hundreds of semi-independent territories, each with its own legal system, its own authorities, its own relationship with witchcraft. There was no central control that might moderate local persecutions. A prince-bishop who wanted to burn witches could do so without interference from anyone. Several German territories became particularly notorious. Bamberg, under Prince Bishop Gottfried Johann Georg, the second Fuchs von Dornheim, known as the Witch Bishop, executed over 600 people between 1626 and 1631. The Prince Bishop built a special witch house with torture chambers, designed specifically for processing accused witches. Efficiently. Wu Erzberg, neighboring Bamberg, was similarly deadly under Prince Bishop Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg. Over 900 people were executed between 1623 and 1631, including children, nobles, and clergy. The Prince Bishop's own nephew was accused and executed. Trier, Cologne, Mainz, the great ecclesiastical principalities of the Rhineland, all saw massive persecutions. The Catholic territories seemed particularly prone to severe witch hunting, though Protestant regions like Saxony also had significant trials. The competition between Catholic and Protestant authorities may have intensified the zeal for demonstrating religious purity. The timing coincided with the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which devastated German territories through military conflict, famine, and disease. The uncertainty and suffering of wartime created perfect conditions for witch hunting. When your village was being ravaged by soldiers and plague, identifying and destroying witches provided at least the illusion of taking action against evil. The German witch trials only ended through exhaustion, economic collapse, depopulation, and eventually changing intellectual attitudes. But before they ended, they had killed more people than the witch trials of all other European countries combined. Scotland, despite its small population, executed more witches per capita than almost any other country. Between 1563 and 1736, approximately 4,000 people were formally accused of witchcraft, and perhaps 2,500 were executed in a country with a total population of under 1 million. The Scottish witch panic had a royal patron. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, was personally convinced that witches had conspired against him. In 1590, during the North Berwick witch trials, accused witches confessed under torture to raising storms to sink the ship carrying James and his new bride from Denmark. James attended some of the interrogations personally. James wrote a book, Daemonologie, arguing for the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of persecution. When he became King of England in 1603, he brought his attitudes south with him. While English witch trials never reached Scottish intensity, James's influence helped maintain them. Scottish procedures were harsh. Torture was authorized by the Privy Council for witchcraft cases. Sleep deprivation was particularly favored. The accused would be kept awake, walked constantly, denied rest until she confessed. The ordeal could last for days, eventually producing confessions to anything. The witch prickers flourished in Scotland, traveling from town to town, finding devil's marks on anyone presented to them. Their fraudulent methods, the retractable pins, were eventually exposed, but not before many innocent people had been condemned on their testimony. The Scottish witch trials showed distinctive features. Demonic pacts and sabbats appeared in confessions, but so did specifically Scottish folklore elements. The devil often appeared in Scottish confessions as a man in black, sometimes at local gathering places that had pre-Christian significance. The trials adapted the continental witch stereotype to local conditions. Scotland's witch trials only ended in the 18th century, later than most of Europe. The last execution was in 1727. The Witchcraft Act wasn't repealed until 1736. The country that had persecuted so intensely was slow to accept that the persecution had been wrong. England's witch trials were less numerous than Scotland's or Germany's, but produced some of the most famous cases. The Pendle witch trial of 1612 remains one of the most thoroughly documented witch trials in history. Pendle Hill, in Lancashire, was a poor, remote area with a reputation for lawlessness and Catholic recusancy. Two families, the Demdikes and the Chattoxes, dominated the local cunning folk trade, providing charms, healing, and divination to their neighbors. They were also bitter rivals. The affair began when Alison Device, granddaughter of the Demdike family matriarch, encountered a peddler who refused to give her some pins. She cursed him. Minutes later, he collapsed from what was probably a stroke. He accused her of witchcraft. Under questioning, Alison confessed and implicated her grandmother, Old Demdike, and the rival Chattox family. Old Demdike, in turn, confessed to witchcraft and named others. The accusations spiraled outward, eventually encompassing 12 people from the Pendle area plus one unconnected woman from a separate incident. The trial was presided over by judges from Lancaster, who were interested in advancing their careers by showing zeal against witchcraft. The chief witness against many of the accused was 9-year-old Janet Device, Alison's younger sister, who testified against her own mother, brother, and others. Her testimony was considered especially credible because of her youth. 10 of the Pendle accused were executed. The case became famous partly because the clerk of the court, Thomas Potts, wrote a detailed account. The wonderful discovery of witches in the county of Lancaster, which preserved the trial records for posterity. The Pendle trial showed English witchcraft at its most local. Family feuds, neighborly tensions, competing cunning folk, all catalyzed by an unfortunate encounter and a justice system eager to find witches. It also showed the devastating power of child testimony, a feature that would reappear at Salem 80 years later. Here's a paradox. The Spanish Inquisition, notorious for religious persecution, was actually relatively skeptical about witchcraft. In Spain, you were less likely to be executed for witchcraft than in Germany, Scotland, or England. The Spanish Inquisition had institutional memory. It had been dealing with accusations of heresy, of secret Judaism, of various religious crimes for centuries. It had developed procedures for evaluating evidence, and it knew that torture produced false confessions. The inquisitors were sophisticated enough to recognize that accused witches were often just telling their torturers what they wanted to hear. In 1614, after a witch panic in the Basque Country produced accusations against nearly 7,000 people, the Inquisition conducted a careful investigation. Alonso de Salazar Fry, as an inquisitor sent to examine the cases, concluded that there was no reliable evidence for any of the accusations. The confessions contradicted each other. The physical evidence was worthless. The entire affair was mass delusion. Salazar's report led the Spanish Inquisition to adopt strict new rules for witchcraft cases. Evidence had to meet rigorous standards. Accusations based solely on torture-produced confessions were suspect. The chain reaction pattern naming names, leading to more arrests, was explicitly recognized as unreliable. The result was that Spain executed far fewer witches than Protestant England or Catholic Germany, the institution most associated with religious persecution, actually showed more restraint than the secular courts and local authorities elsewhere in Europe. This doesn't make the Spanish Inquisition admirable. It persecuted viciously for heresy, for suspected Jewish practices, for various other religious crimes. But on witchcraft specifically, its institutional skepticism saved lives. The comparison highlights how the witch trials were driven not by the most powerful institutions, but by local courts. local authorities, local hatreds, without centralized oversight to moderate them. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment about what dark historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Because now we need to discuss the children both, those who accused and those who died. Child accusers were powerful weapons in witch trials. Children were presumed innocent and capable of sophisticated deception. If a child said she had seen someone at a Sabbath, had been tormented by someone's specter, had witnessed someone working magic, the testimony was devastating. Adults might lie, but surely children told the truth. The Salem witch trials would later make this dynamic famous, but it appeared throughout European witch trials. In Sweden, in 1668 to 1676, children's accusations drove a massive panic that killed around 300 people. Children claimed to have been taken to Sabbaths, to have witnessed diabolical proceedings, to know who in the community were witches. Their testimony was believed, and hundreds died. Sometimes children were coached, deliberately or inadvertently. Adults leading questions shaped what children said. Children learned what answers produced approval, attention, relief from their own fear of being accused. The dynamic between frightened children and credulous adults produced testimony that seemed compelling, but was essentially fiction. Children could also be accused. The logic was simple. If witches could recruit anyone, why not children? If children could be taken to Sabbaths, perhaps they had become witches themselves. The age of reason around 7 in Catholic theology was often the threshold. Children above that age could be held responsible, could be tortured, could be executed. In Wurzburg, during the peak of the trials, children as young as 7 were burned. In some cases, entire orphanages were investigated, children accusing each other in cascading waves of terror. The adults who ran the trials seemed to feel no particular compunction about torturing and killing children. They were witches, after all, servants of Satan, regardless of their age. The use of children on both sides of the accusations showed how completely the witch trial logic could override normal human protective instincts. The framework was so powerful that even children, the most vulnerable, the most in need of protection, could be transformed into either weapons or victims. Some men made careers out of witch hunting. They traveled from place to place, offering their expertise in identifying, examining, and prosecuting witches. Were they sincere believers doing God's work, or cynical operators exploiting superstition for profit? Matthew Hopkins, England's self-styled witch-finder general, was perhaps the most notorious. In just 2 years, 1645 to 1647, he was responsible for more executions than had occurred in England in the previous century. He developed systematic methods, sleep deprivation to produce confessions. The swimming test searches for the devil's mark. Hopkins charged fees for his services, making witch hunting a profitable business. Towns paid him to identify and examine their witches, and he delivered. The more witches he found, the more work he generated. There's no evidence he found a single actual witch, because there were no actual witches to find. But he found plenty of people to execute. Pierre de Lancre, a French judge, conducted a massive witch hunt in the Basque region in 1609. He was convinced that the entire region was infected with witchcraft, a belief perhaps influenced by cultural prejudice against the Basque people, whose language and customs differed from French norms. He sent around 80 people to the stake. De Lancre seemed genuinely to believe in the threat he was fighting. His writings describe Sabbats in vivid detail, clearly drawing on confessions he had extracted. He was a true believer, which made him all the more dangerous. The cynical operator might stop when the prophet dried up. The true believer never stopped until forced. These witch hunters operated with official sanction, but often exceeded any reasonable authority. Hopkins had no legal appointment. He simply declared himself witch-finder general, and communities accepted his expertise. The lack of institutional oversight meant that a single fanatic or fraud could cause enormous damage before anyone stopped them. Hopkins died young, in 1647, probably of tuberculosis. Legend claimed he was eventually swimming tested and found to be a witch himself, but there's no evidence for this satisfying story. He died in his bed, having killed dozens, perhaps hundreds, of innocent people. The worst witch trials were like fires that burned until they ran out of fuel. Communities consumed themselves, executing so many people that normal social functioning became impossible. Ellwangen, which we mentioned earlier, lost over 400 people in 2 years, perhaps 1 in 30 of its total population. But other cases were proportionally even worse. The town of Opnau in Baden executed 50 people in 163-11632 from a population of perhaps a few hundred. The village of Offenburg executed 79 people between 1627 and 1629. What did it mean for a community to lose that many people? It meant that everyone knew someone who had been executed. It meant that the people who ran the local businesses, who farmed the fields, who raised the children, were gone. It meant orphans, abandoned properties, economic collapse, the complete breakdown of social trust. The trials often targeted people essential to the community's functioning. Midwives were particularly vulnerable. They were present at births, and when infants died, as infants often did, they could be blamed. Healers were vulnerable. Their treatments sometimes failed, and failure could be reinterpreted as deliberate harm. The very people communities depended on were the people the trials consumed, and the trials couldn't stop themselves. Each confession named more names. Each execution created more orphans, more grievances, more social disruption that might generate new accusations. The only way out was external intervention, a higher authority ordering the trials to stop or complete exhaustion. Some communities simply collapsed. Villages were abandoned. Populations scattered. The survivors left, seeking places where the witch hunters hadn't come, where they might rebuild lives not overshadowed by the smoke of the pyres. The European witch trials didn't end with a single dramatic event. They faded away, gradually, unevenly, over the course of the 17th and early 18th centuries. Different factors combined to make witch hunting seem less urgent, less credible, less acceptable. The intellectual climate shifted. The scientific revolution, beginning in the 16th century, promoted explanations based on natural causes rather than supernatural intervention. Educated elites increasingly viewed witchcraft accusations with skepticism. The confessions that seemed so compelling began to look like the products of torture rather than evidence of real events. Writers and philosophers attacked the witch trials. Friedrich Spee, a Jesuit priest who had served as confessor to accused witches in Germany, published a devastating critique in 1631. He had seen innocent people confess under torture. He knew the system was broken. His Caudio Criminalis argued that the methods used to find witches would convict anyone, guilty or innocent. legal reforms raised standards of evidence. Torture was increasingly restricted or abolished. Without torture, confessions dried up. Without confessions, convictions became harder to obtain. The machinery of persecution lost its most effective component. The great crisis that had fueled witch hunting eased. The wars of religion ended. The Little Ice Age moderated. Plague outbreaks became less frequent. As the general level of fear and instability declined, so did the need to find scapegoats for misfortune. The trials themselves had discredited witch hunting. Too many obviously innocent people had been executed. The accusations had reached too high, consuming officials, clergy, people who clearly couldn't be witches. The absurdity of charging entire communities with witchcraft became impossible to ignore. But the end was slow. The last executions in Germany occurred in the 1770s. The last in Switzerland was in 1782. The last in Poland was in 1793. 300 years of persecution didn't end with a bang, but with a gradual, grudging acceptance that the whole enterprise had been a terrible mistake. Anna, Gold the Eye, is sometimes called the last witch executed in Western Europe. She died in Switzerland in 1782, more than a century after the witch trials had peaked. An anachronism, a reminder that the old beliefs hadn't entirely disappeared. Anna was a maidservant in the household of Johann Jakob Tschudi, a physician in the town of Glarus. She had worked there for several years when the household's young daughter began suffering mysterious symptoms, convulsions, spitting up pins and nails, strange behaviors that seemed to have no medical explanation. Suspicion fell on Anna. She was accused of bewitching the child, of putting objects into her food to cause the affliction. Under questioning, she allegedly confessed to making a pact with the devil, to receiving powers from Satan, to causing the child's illness through magic. The confession was problematic from the start. Anna recanted repeatedly, claiming it had been coerced. There were strong indications that she was actually the victim of an affair gone wrong, some historians believe. Tschudi had an inappropriate relationship with her and accused her of witchcraft to cover it up or punish her for rejecting him. The authorities knew they were on shaky ground. Witchcraft was no longer officially a crime in Switzerland. It had been removed from the criminal code decades earlier. They charged Anna with poisoning instead, a legal fiction that allowed them to proceed without formally reviving witchcraft statutes. Anna was executed by decapitation in June 1782. Case attracted attention and criticism throughout Europe. Enlightenment commentators pointed to it as evidence of barbarism, of superstition surviving into the modern age. The Swiss authorities were embarrassed. In 2008, the Parliament of the Canton of Glarus formally exonerated Anna Goya, declaring her execution a judicial murder. It took 226 years for justice to be done, far too late for Anna, but a recognition at last that she, like the tens of thousands before her, had died for a crime that never existed. And so our time among the witch hunters comes to an end. The pyres are cold now. The torture chambers are museums, if they survive at all. The Malleus Maleficarum is studied by historians, not used by judges. The witch, as the trials imagined her Satan's servant, attender of Sabbaths, destroyer of crops, and killer of children, never existed. She was a construction, a nightmare given form by frightened minds and cruel methods. and she existed only in confessions extracted through unbearable pain. But the people who died were real. 50,000, 60,000, perhaps more each one, a human being with a name, a family, a life cut short by neighbors' accusations and judges' convictions. They were healers and beggars, widows and wives, the old and the young, the poor and occasionally the rich. They had done nothing except attract suspicion, make enemies, or simply be in the wrong place when the accusation started. The witch trials teach us something terrible about human nature. They show how easily fear can override reason, how quickly communities can turn against their own members, how the machinery of persecution, once started, becomes almost impossible to stop. They show that educated people, judges, priests, physicians can believe in manifest absurdities when those absurdities serve their purposes. They show that torture produces not truth, but whatever the torturer wants to hear. They also show that it can end. The witch trials stopped because people began to doubt, began to question, began to insist on evidence and reason rather than confession and accusation. The Enlightenment wasn't just an intellectual movement. It was a moral one, a refusal to keep killing people for imaginary crimes. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, spare a thought for those who died. The women dragged from their homes in the night. The men who couldn't prove their innocence because innocence wasn't a defense. The children, accusers and accused, caught up in a madness not of their making. They lived in a world where a neighbor's whisper could be a death sentence, where any misfortune could be blamed on hidden enemies, where the desire to find someone to punish overrode the duty to find the truth. We like to think we're beyond that now. We like to think that our enlightened age wouldn't make such mistakes. But the impulse to find scapegoats, to blame the vulnerable for our misfortunes, to see conspiracies where there are only coincidences, that impulse hasn't disappeared. The witch trials are not just history. They're a warning. The fires are out. The accusations have stopped. But the lesson remains. How easily we can be convinced that our neighbors are our enemies, and how terrible the consequences when we act on that belief not rest well. No one is coming to accuse you tonight. The witch hunters are gone. But remember them. Remember what they did. And remember that it happened not in some distant, barbaric past, but in the same Europe that was painting masterpieces, writing symphonies, and building cathedrals. The beauty and the horror existed side by side, as they always do. Sleep now. Tomorrow will be safer than yesterday. We have learned something, at least. We must hope we don't forget.